You might think that having a great big brain is usually a good thing, but is it? Wildlife biologist Eric Abelson has done something unusual. He's compared extinction risk with relative encephalization size, that is, how big your brain is compared to your body. And well, we'll come to the results in just a minute, but to start, I asked him about the pros and cons of having a large brain.
There's generally believed to be a trade-off between brain size and behavioral flexibility. So the idea here is that on one side, a larger relative brain size or more neural tissue is very expensive. It's very costly metabolically. An animal either has to ingest more calories or spend fewer calories in other places in order to maintain and build that large brain size. The trade-off is that larger relative brain sizes have been correlated with longer lifespans, with more complex social intelligence, increased learning capabilities. These species have been found to be more likely to do well if they're introduced to a new landscape or a new environment. One of the ways that a bigger brain might be able to help an animal is that you can imagine a new species that comes out onto the landscape, and perhaps a new predator. Being able to recognize that new predator and initiate the appropriate behavioral responses to that predator is critical for an animal. And perhaps species with these larger relative brain sizes and greater capacity for behavioral flexibility might be able to recognize those species more readily, and then being able to behave appropriately in response would be potentially tremendously beneficial.
Okay, so does that mean that we see over evolution? Do we just generally see brains getting bigger? Is that a sort of universal trait in creatures with brains?
If we look at earlier mammals, there were much less variability in brain size, and the brain sizes tend to be much smaller. But if we look over time, brain size has increased, but relative brain size variation has increased dramatically. So some species have much larger relative brain sizes than they had in earlier evolutionary periods of time.
Okay, so in this new paper, Eric, you've done something which I don't know whether anyone's ever thought of this before, but you've looked at brain size, relative brain size, with creatures, with mammals on the red list, on the endangered list, so species threatened with extinction. So my first question is, well, what prompted this? What was the idea behind asking this, I think, slightly unusual question?
I am fascinated by wildlife behavior, and I think that wildlife behavior can hold some really interesting avenues of research and insights into conservation biology. Relative brain size has been correlated with many different behavioral traits, many different behavioral characteristics, things like learning capacity and social intelligence. But what hadn't been explored in mammals was if brain size, potentially a proxy for a suite of other behavioral characteristics, could then be applied to the sort of ultimate measure of species success, which is the ability to avoid extinction.
In the new study, you've looked at exactly that question. So we're going through a wave of extinction, possibly the sixth great extinction in the history of life on Earth, and you compared it to the brain sizes of the creatures being threatened with extinction, creatures on the red list. And what did you find?
What I found was that species that had larger relative brain sizes were more likely to be endangered than those that had smaller relative brain sizes.
See, that's the big surprise for me. When I was reading this paper, I was thinking, well, creatures with bigger brains have got more complex lives, more adaptability in situations and new environments and all those things that we've talked about. So why would they be under more pressure to go extinct? That it feels very counterintuitive, your result.
It's a great point, and I was equally puzzled when I found the results. In fact, I thought, well, there must be something wrong. And I think one of the interesting things that might be going on here, it goes back to that trade-off that larger relative brain size comes with a very substantial cost. That's why every species doesn't just have the biggest relative brain size that it might. These species that have large relative brain sizes have to pay for that with increased calorie input. Well, maybe in a landscape where there were very few extinctions and the pressures were very low in general, then having a big brain might help a species. But in the current landscape, one could speculate that what's happening is that the larger relative brain size becomes a liability. You can imagine, for example, a fish that's living in a stream that's completely polluted. You can outthink some problems, but living in a polluted stream may have no cognitive solutions. And so the benefits of that larger relative brain size may not really be able to be recognized in some of these more anthropogenic landscapes.
I think many of our listeners will be thinking exactly this. There's one big exception to this, which is us, right? We have the highest ratio of brain size to body of all creatures. And I don't think we're currently at risk of extinction. So what would happen if you included humans in your study?
Humans weren't included in the study, and so I can't say anything directly about humans other than to say that the results generally find that large-brained mammals are more likely to be endangered, but that's at smaller body sizes. So at larger body sizes, the effect of brain size plays a diminished role.
But I wonder if there's anything useful in terms of like making predictions about species risk for extinction using the data that you've come up with.
Absolutely. That is one of the greatest hopes that I have for these results. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature has identified around 5,500 mammal species, and of those, we know around 20% are endangered, and about 65% are of species of least concern, considered not endangered. But there's a full 15% of species that we just don't have enough information on to know what their endangerment status is. So I hope that these data and these results can help us identify species to target to try to protect biodiversity in the future.
Eric Abelson, who did that work while he was at Stanford University, he's now with the US Forest Service. So, big brains may be a good predictor of endangerment status, with one key exception being us. And we, of course, are also the main threat to conservation of species, and at the same time, the one species capable of rectifying it.